In this section, we're going to look into the concept of constitution and constitutionalism, and concept related to the classification of constitution. Constitution can be classified based on rigid constitution and flexible constitution, or unitary constitution and federal constitution, flexible and unitary constitution, and etc. and so on. Now, what is a constitution? The first thing that we need to fix is about the definition or the concept related to constitution. A constitution consists of the fundamental law of a country. It just includes the basic rules or regulations, values, traditions, norms, customs, standard, aspiration that channels internal affairs of a country and give direction to a country's foreign relation. So it is a document containing essential principles on distribution of governmental power as well as rights and responsibility of the citizens. A constitution also indicates economic, political, and social policy of a given country. Right? Constitution is also defined as a body of doctrines and practice that form the fundamental organizing principle of the political system. So, in this regard, constitution is understood as the highest law of the land that prevails over all other law of the country. Right? Yes, constitution is different from a specific law because it is the highest law of a given country. It's brief and general in outline. But what's constitutionalism? Constitutionalism means the government by constitution or practice of the government regulated by the constitution. Right? Though it is a concept, constitutionalism is a concept which implies constitutional provisions and full realization or implementation of the principle of constitution. It is a culture in which the government officials act in accordance with the rule of law. Constitutionalism is, in other words, the way that public authority is to be exercised, implemented, and applied according to the law. Hence, constitutionalism is more than having a constitution. In short, it implies the proper implementation or practice of the principles which are included in the constitution. It also refers to the prevalence of the rule of law, where the government and the public officials are held accountable to the people and responsible for the decision and action. Now let's look into the function or purpose of constitutions. The first function, it serves as the framework for the government, which means a constitution is the plan for organizing composition and structure of the government. It establishes the foundation for the government. Constitution also grants power to the government. Constitution provides authority to the government to accomplish its task and to make different decisions. Constitution limits government power. In other words, Constitution determines what public authority must do and must not do. It restricts the extent or degree of officials' power. Government authorities should not do whatever they wish to do, but according to their Constitution. The working of the government officials in the spirit of the Constitution ensures the rule of law. Constitution serves as the supreme law of a country. Constitution is the source of all specific law with regard to different affairs in the country, or other laws are derived from the Constitution. When details are made in a country, constant reference should be made to the Constitution. All laws in the country must conform to the Constitutions. Likewise, any law that contradicts with the Constitution will not be valid as a law in the country. Thus, contradiction or Constitution serves as a founding instrument of all other laws in the country. Generally, the very purpose and function of the Constitution are closely linked with the ever-increasing demand to limit the absolute power of the governor and guaranteeing the right of the governed. Now let's look into the classification of constitutions. Constitution in different political systems differ from one another in terms of their principle, based on the distribution of political power, or based on the structural separation of authority among the branch of the government, and based on the limitation they set on the government authority. Moreover, constitutions of various countries differ from each other based on their forms, content, and pattern of political arrangements. So this difference may have been caused due to difference in historical background, social tradition, and political practice. In some cases, constitutions tend to be the product of compromise and consensus of the different social and political forces of the society, and in other sense, power holding the government with the aim of securing the desired political and socio-economic interests through constitution. Generally, constitutions of different countries are not only differing in the form and appearance, but they also differ in terms of the content of the underlying principle and procedure. The first classification of constitution is written versus unwritten constitution. In terms of the form, constitution are classified into written and unwritten constitution. A written constitution is the one that exists in a single document containing the basic principle and rules specifying the right and the duty of citizens and the composition and power of the institution of the government. In this written constitution, all political structure and institution of the state are organized in accordance with the principles stated in a single written document, but the majority of the constitution in the world are written constitution. The point that you have to know, the majority of the constitution in the world are written constitution. For example, India, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, France, Germany, United States of America, and the like have written constitution. A written constitution has its own advantage and disadvantage. Now let's look into the advantage of a written constitution. The first is it is full of clarity and definiteness because the provisions are written in details. And it also readily available to citizens to enable monitor the behavior of the government and prevent the emergence of dictatorship. Moreover, as it is easily available to citizens, it helps them easily know their rights and duties. A written constitution also has the quality of stability and ability to help citizens develop a sense of confidence and satisfaction. Since the people know since the people know of the nature of the constitutional provision, they feel a sense of satisfaction and confidence for being their right accorded with the legal protection of the constitution. At the same time, it has also its own disadvantage because it creates a situation of rigidity. It's difficult to change it easily and quickly as per the requirement of the time, or it's not easily adaptable to new changes. Implementation of the constitution usually involves interpretation. In some instance, interpretation leads to disputes between branches of the government. Now, uh, let's look into unwritten constitution. Unwritten constitution is a document based on common traditions, usage of the country. It's meant that the fundamental principle and power of the government are not written in a single codified document. In other words, there is no single written document that specifies the rights and the duties of the citizens in the composition of the power of the institution of the government. And instead, principles exist in a number of documents, customs, and conventions. In short, unwritten constitution is a collection of documents, rules, regulations, declarations, and traditional practice that serves as the governing principle. These elements were passed either by the parliament or other competent government body at different times without compiling into a single document. Unwritten constitution is used, for example, in Great Britain, New Zealand, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the like. Great Britain constitution is a typical example of unwritten constitution. Like that of written constitution, unwritten constitution have their own advantage and disadvantage. Now let's look into the advantage of unwritten constitution. The first advantage of unwritten constitution is it has a quality of elasticity and adaptability. It is also dynamic that it prevents the chance of popular uprising because the government will easily amend it based on the demand of the public. Third, unwritten constitution is resilient. As a result, it can absorb and recover from the shocks that may destroy a written constitution. But it also has its own disadvantage. It's not stable and could easily be abused by the politicians who are responsible to the interest of the public. Right? It can be easily misused by the politician. Unwritten constitution is also it may lead to a state of confusion because it's not easily available to citizens. It's not suitable in democratic political system because in democratic political system, the government is required to make citizens know their rights and duties. Now let's look into the third classification of constitutions, which is rigid and flexible constitution. A rigid constitution is a constitution that cannot be easily amended, but the procedure for amending the rigid constitution is kind of difficult, cumbersome, expensive, and time consuming. Whereas in flexible constitution, it is more flexible. In other words, it can be changed in accordance with the requirement of the time, in accordance with the interest of the public, and according with the interest of the governor. A rigid constitution brings about stable government because it cannot easily be changed or flexed in accordance with the interests of the corrupted officials. But a flexible constitution can easily be corrupted, can easily be misused. There is no flexibility in flexible constitution, but there is flexibility in flexible constitution. A rigid constitution is suitable for federal system of the government with heterogeneous population, whereas flexible constitution is more adaptable to the unitary system of government with homogeneous population. The constitution is easy to amend in rigid constitution. The constitution is easy to amend in a flexible constitution, but the government can change the content of the constitution. But a rigid constitution can lead to an ideal and desirable change or amended by the government. The fourth classification of constitution is federal versus unitary constitution. A federal constitution involves dual government, that is the national government and the regional government, central government and the peripheral government. And in unitary constitutions, there is a single political power. In other words, most of the political power resides in the center. 90% of the political power resides in the center. Only a very limited amount of power resides in the region. In other words, most of the decision-making and policy-making process of the country flows from the center to the periphery. In other words, there is no devolution of power in the unitary constitution. Most of the federal constitution is a written constitution, whereas the unitary constitution is a constitution can be written just like France, for example. France actually is not completely unitary or completely federal, but can be considered as a kind of a mixture of federal and unitary kind of government, or unwritten, just like Britain. Federal constitution, division of power between the national and the regional government, that's clear. And in a unitary constitution, no division of power. The most 90 and more than 90% of the power resides in the hand of the president or in the center. All power vested in the national government. A supremacy of the constitution is mainly emphasized in the federal government, whereas in the unitary constitutions, the constitution may be supreme, just like Japan, or may not be supreme, just like Britain. What's supreme in the unitary constitution is the custom, the rules, traditions, and values of the community. Federal constitution is highly rigid constitution, whereas the unitary constitution is very flexible constitution. The constitution may be rigid, just like France, or it is, but mainly it is very flexible, just like Britain. In federal constitution, the independent judiciary, the judiciary may be independent, but may not be independent. In other words, the judiciary may be part and parcel of the government itself. The bicameral legislation in federal government. Legislation may be bicameral or unicameral in China, but mainly in unitary constitutions, the legislature are mainly unicameral government. Now let's look into the origin and development of constitution. Before looking into the origin and development of constitution in European context, we need to explore the origin and development of constitution in the international context. The historical evolution of constitution can be traced back to the early stage of civilization. The idea of constitution as a political phenomenon extend further into the previous historical period. In the history of human society, the emergence of the constitutional government is related to the desire to limit the absolute power of rulers over those who are ruled. Different political experience of the governance, political rights, roles, and relations to society developed through time. In this regard, many cultures influenced and shaped the development of constitutional thinking, thought, and action of different cultures of the society since ancient times have contributed for the appearance of the modern concept of constitution in the development of constitutional practice. The first attempt to develop a constitution can be found in Hammurabi's law. Let's explore some elements or some features of the Hammurabi's law, which developed some 1700 before the birth of Christ. Hammurabi was an ancient Babylonian king, and his legal traditions were not concerned with the issue of freedom and rights of citizens. Instead, attention was given to the maintained forceful order. In other words, rules were aimed at consolidating the authority of the ruler, who claimed justification that the laws was originated from supernatural force or divine being. So subjects who didn't obey the laws would be seriously punished, and any criticism against the laws was unacceptable. Thus, Hammurabi's law established a highly authoritarian rule. The modern sense of constitutionalism was not known in Hammurabi law. There was no limit on the authority of the government. In other words, Hammurabi law introduced the concept of constitution, but it didn't introduce the concept of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is a later phenomenon. So the relation between the government and the people was not based on equality. The Hammurabi's law introduced a legal system of governance or legality, but not the idea of constitution and democratic practices. Second development is Hebrews' theocratic constitutionalism. The Hebrews were the first to practice constitutionalism. They emphasized on limiting rulers' absolute power by divine law. So subjects claimed that they lived under divine guidance, and the rulers on earth were considered as God's agents. Thus, rulers were expected to have moral obligation to their subjects. When rulers became unjust in practicing law, prophets claiming spiritual authority arose to advise, warn, and resist them. Though this is considered as the first legitimate position against established authority. However, Jewish understanding of justice was based on religious thinking. That's the point again is to underline here. It was based on religious thinking, not on free will of the governed, and hence the contemporary idea of political rights didn't exist in the Hebrew theocratic constitutionalism. The third development in the development of constitution is Greek constitutional democracy. The Greeks were the first to exercise democratic governance during the 5th and the 4th century. They developed a fully constitutional political civilization. The constitutional idea of the Greek includes popular participation of all citizens in decision-making through direct democracy. There was no possibility for political power to be held in the hand of the few. It also involved a sharing of power and state function. Moreover, the system also included a mechanism of limiting the power of the office holder. Right? The office holders were usually selected by the votes. In some office that required qualification analogy, the office holders were designed by election. All active citizens had access to the public office. When public officials tended to abuse power, condemnation and exclusion from social acceptance were exercised, so the office were also short. Therefore, political power was randomly and rationally shared. Officials and citizens also made observance to the rule of law. However, the constitutional democracy of the Greek was not absolutely perfect. The assembly of citizens was without any constitutional limitation. That is, the kind of democracy exercised was excessive. As a result of this, the Greek political system was unstable and full of internal disharmony. The fifth development in the development of constitution is the Roman Republican constitutions. Romans introduced a republican system of governance. The concept republic itself is originated from the Romans law, some around 600 to 100 before the birth of Christ. The republicans constitutionalism was not completely left at the mercy of the citizens and not completely controlled by the absolute monarchy. Roman exercised distribution of power among the different assemblies, which were meant to be complex devices of check and balance on each other's power. Officials were elected by assembly of the citizens and for the term of a year at a time. Thus, republicanism was a form of constitutional supremacy of legitimate officials and bodies for limiting the purpose and peerage. The Romans also established a system of civil and criminal law, which is the source of the legal code of many modern nations. Republicanism emphasized the operation of the elaborate legal system and institutional means of limiting the power. Anyhow, the influence of citizens in governance process was limited through it was conducted on legally or popularly accepted ways. Eventually, the Romans republic degenerated and resulted in absolute rule. Magna Carta. In its modern sense, Magna Carta can be considered the first constitution of England, but in the strict sense of the term, England adopted its first constitution in the 7th century. Magna Carta introduced in the 13th century by King John, who used to rule his people unfairly and selfishly. Then the people forced to revolt against King John, and King John therefore forced to sign a charter called the Magna Carta. Magna Carta, which literally means the Great Charter. And Magna Carta puts restriction upon king's power for the first time in the history of England. Magna Carta nowadays can be considered as an inspiration source of information for most of the constitution of England, France, constitution, and their human rights documents mainly adopts many elements from Magna Carta. Overview of the constitutional experience in Ethiopia. Traditional constitutional experience in Ethiopia. Before the adoption of the 1931 constitution, there were traditional experience of constitution in Ethiopia. The modern Ethiopian empire, which was created in the last quarter of the 19th century, didn't possess written constitutions until 1931. But this does not mean that the various nations and nationalities of Ethiopia didn't have customs, social norms that regulate their day-to-day activities, their day-to-day life. The different ethnic entities in Ethiopia had their own customary laws and highly developed cultural norms which governed their society. For example, the Christian kingdom in North Ethiopia, the Abyssinian core, had for centuries lived according to the Futuh Negest. The Futuh Negest is also called the legislation of the king. It is the most highly respected legal document in Ethiopia, which even in the modern times contributed and continued to be cited by the judge. It's interesting to note that the Futuh Negest has two parts. The first part is based mainly on the Holy Scripture in the ecclesiastical canons of the Egyptian Coptic Church, and second secular part is described as the canon of the king. The Futuh Negest continued to serve until it was replaced by the 1931 Haile Selassie Constitution. In addition to the Futuh Negest, there were also other traditional documents such as the Kebra Negest and the Sra'ate Mengist, which contributed a lot to the development of constitution in Ethiopia. Sra'ate Mengist has provided administrative and protocol direction since the 19th century. So, this document, at the body of doctrine, set out the laws through which the society was governed. And in this regard, until the early 1930s, the Ethiopian Empire was based on tradition and customary political and legal premises. Generally, the traditional constitution experience was characterized by the dominance of myth and legend. The myth and legend that provided legitimacy were the myth of the Solomonic dynasty based on Kebra Negest. The Kebra Negest emphasized on the divine right rule. So it states that the Ethiopian monarch derived their power to rule from God, and therefore they were not accountable to any secular power. Alright? So the myth and legend provided almost no opportunity for Ethiopian people to participate in political affairs and to influence the decision-making process of the nation. The people were merely considered to be subject of the king. The existence of different traditional documents like Futuh Negest tell us that before 1931 there was no fundamental and all-embracing document stated as the Ethiopian constitution. There were rules growing out of the history of the nation and that operated to secure harmonious action between and among the distinct entities and make up the polity. Whereas when it comes to modern constitutional experience in Ethiopia, in its modern history, Ethiopia has experienced three constitutions, namely the monarchical constitution of the 1961 constitution, and which later revised the 1955 constitution, and the 1987 People Democratic Republic of Ethiopian constitution, and the 1995 Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which actually take elements from the transitional constitution. So this constitution have reflected on values and political objective as per the nature of the successive Ethiopian governments. Now let's explore their basic features. The 1931 written constitution of Ethiopia in the literature of the Ethiopian legal system, the 1931 constitution has been given a wider attention. There are many reasons for this, but the most important feature of the 1931 constitution of Ethiopia is the first written modern constitution, right? It furnished the formal base for the government and consolidation of the imperial power. It also illustrated both the theoretical and practical problem of integrating traditional political system with imperial Selassie's policies of modernization and centralization. It also emphasized the reputation of Haile Selassie as a reformer and modernizer both at home and abroad. The Council was introduced in order to achieve Ethiopia's diplomatic recognition abroad and to strengthen Haile Selassie's authority at home. The 1931 constitution was not a reform measure in response to popular demand from Ethiopian citizens. There was little or no attention to guaranteeing political freedom and fundamental human rights to Ethiopians, rather than creating a limited monarchy. The constitution gave all sovereignty and power to the emperor. The people were considered as the mere subjects and not as citizens with the political and civil rights. And generally, the 1931 constitution was formulated to attain the following two basic purposes that would advance the emperor's authority and political control. First, at the first place, the constitution was intended to give Ethiopia the image of modernity in the international community, because Ethiopia was considered as uncivilized state in the eye of the Western colonial power. Secondly, in the domestic affair, the 1931 Constitution aimed at providing a legal framework for subordination of the power of traditional nobility to the imperial. Thus, the Constitution served the interest of the emperor. It was mainly designed to affirm the absolute power of the emperor in the political life of the country, rather than guaranteeing the rights and freedom of the Ethiopian citizens. Evidently, the 1931 Constitution can be referred to as the Charter of the Absolute Power of the Monarchy. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, the 1917 Constitution is considered as an instrument of modernization in that it introduced some modern institutions, right? It introduced some modern elements. Among these modern elements, it introduced the parliamentary system. For the first time in the history of Ethiopia, the 1931 Constitution introduced the parliamentary system. The core contribution of the 1917 Constitution was the creation of the parliament. The parliament consisted of two chambers or two houses, namely the Senate or the upper house, which also known in Amharic የህግ መወሰኛ ምክር ቤት, and the chamber of the deputies የህግ መምሪያ ምክር ቤት. In this regard, the parliament and its structure was a bicameral, having two houses. Those elected to the two houses or to the two chambers were only noblemen and princes, and their term of office was not limited. However, the constitution didn't provide power and functions of parliament. It was a weak institution to decide on matters related to law. Power to make laws was vested with the emperor, and the parliament was nominal, a kind of superficial, which mainly assigned to approve the legislation of the emperor. It also introduced annual budget system. The second major contribution of the 1931 Constitution was the introduction of the idea of providing fixed annual budget for the government. However, the assignment of budget as indicated in the Constitution had not been properly implemented. The third contribution is the ministerial system. The Constitution provided the institutional framework for the ministerial system. However, the executive branch of the government was heavily centralized in the hand of the emperor, and individually and collectively the ministry were completely subordinated to the emperor. The 1931 Constitution also introduced the judicial system. The fourth major contribution of the 1931 Constitution was the introduction of the two-part system of court. These were the regular court that deal with the civil and criminal cases, and the administrative tribunals which concern with the civil case that affect the government. At the top of the court system was the imperial chulot, የንጉስ ችሎት or ዙፋን ችሎት, where the imperial reviewed cases and can change any judicial decision. In all respects, whatever the constitution is innovative, it was more of a paper value. Thus, the 1931 Constitution was undemocratic in its nature. The main objective of the 1931 Constitution was to justify the centralized and absolute authority of Imperial Haile Selassie over internal and external affairs of the country. The 1955 or the revised constitutions, after nearly 25 years experiment of written constitution, Ethiopia entered into the second phase of the constitutional development. The second written constitution of Ethiopia was revised constitution. It was promulgated on the 4th of November 1955. The 1955 Constitution was similar to that of the 1931, but the political principle and objective of the 1955 Constitution was much more clearer in pronouncing the power and function of the imperial government. It also included some provisions bearing advanced democratic ideas compared to the previous written constitution. It should be noted that the historical and political process of the Ethiopian state and society influenced the content and issues addressed in the revised constitution. Like the 1931 constitution, however, the revised constitution didn't involve a popular process for ratification. It was a gift, quote unquote, gift from the emperor to his subject on the occasion of celebrating his 25 years in power. That celebrates Jubilee. In terms of enhancing popular sovereignty, the principle and manner of implementing the revised constitution made little or no progress. There were major historical and political factors, however, that forced the revised constitution to come into being. One of the essential prerequisites or preconditions for the constitutional revision was the Act of Federation of Eritrea with Ethiopia in 1952. Eritrea, that had been under Italian colonial rule for decades and later under the British Protectorate, was federated with Ethiopia following the decision made by United Nations General Assembly in 1952. Under the supervision of the United Nations, the Eritrean Constitution of the 1952 was drafted, providing a separate system of government for Eritrea and the sovereign Ethiopian crown. The Federation of Eritrea therefore created abnormal political system. It created abnormal political situation. First, the Federal Act was not strictly federal in its nature. Ethiopia remained a unitary state with absolute rule of the imperium, while Eritrea obtained an entirely different government. In other words, there emerged two separate governments based on entirely different principles. That's elected government in Eritrea and an absolute monarch in Ethiopia. Thus, both were exercising different power over the same territory. Second abnormal situation is that in its nature, the Eritrean constitution implied a more liberal government that incorporates some element of democratic society as a result of their colonial tradition. They were a quasi half political and half religious group in Eritrea, while in Ethiopia, political grouping outside the royal crown was a personal offense to the imperial, therefore illegal. Thus, the emperor saw it necessary to settle this political abnormality by granting the revised constitution in 1955. Therefore, one can clearly observe that the origin of the revised constitution was related mainly with the historical factor of the time, rather than being simply adopted from foreign constitution as in the case of the 1931 constitution. So as far as the content and issues addressed are concerned, the revised constitution mainly maintained some of the basic principles of the 1931 Constitution. However, it incorporated some new concepts and it was much more elaborated than its predecessor. It has 131 articles divided into 8 chapters. The first 2 chapters, comprising nearly one-third of the articles, were concerned with the defining the power and authority of the emperor and the privilege of the imperial family. Only one chapter was revised to deal with the rights and mortgage of the people. Its democratic character can simply be inferred from the emphasis given to the authority of the imperial. It further developed the centralizing and modernizing themes of the 1931 Constitution. The revised constitution more strongly established absolute power of the monarch, so it declares the inviolability of the imperial's dignity. And the emperor could appoint and dismiss government officials in all branches of the government as he wished. The emperor also had the power to dissolve the parliament. Any law could not come into effect unless the emperor approved it. Moreover, his power also extends the extent of the determining the administrative effort of the church itself. So in short, the 1955 revised constitution made the power and authority of the emperor absolute and complete in the Ethiopian state and society. So it consolidated the executive, legislative, and judicial power of the Emperor Haile Selassie. So in contrast, little or no significance was attached to the need to guarantee the political and human rights of the Ethiopian people. The constitution expressed intention of protecting individual rights in terms of property, life, and private affairs. By far, the most striking change was the provision for the election of them appointed member of the Chamber of the Deputy by the people, and this body was also made to have the power, at least in a textual sense, and not question the ministers with a view to hold the government accountable. Meanwhile, the veto power of the emperor is still there. The third modern constitution of Ethiopia is 1987 People Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution. The 1974 Ethiopian Revolution resulted in the deposition of Emperor Haile Selassie from power. However, the military junta that formed the military council known as the Derg controlled the political power. The Derg emerged to be the military government in Ethiopia. The military regime suspended the 1955 revised constitution and began to rule the country by the series of decrees and proclamations. The constitutional process of the government was foiled. In order to deepen its power, the Derg established its single party, the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. In 1987, this was transitioned from a no-party system to one-party system in Ethiopian history. Nevertheless, it didn't give rise to the democratic order. In 1987, the Derg Constitution was issued justifying its rule. It introduced the first republic whereby abolishing the seat of monarchy in Ethiopia. It drafted from the previous constitution in some ways. It differed in some respects. The Constitutional Commission, through a program of public consultation, drafted it, and it was later on ratified in the name of the broad popular participation. In principle, some of the provisions of the Derg Constitution include the democratic elements. Sovereignty lies on the workers of Ethiopia and exercised through the national Shengo, local Shengos, and they established by election and referendum. Candidates to the National Shengo were nominated by organ of the Workers' Party of Ethiopia, mass organizations, military units, and other bodies. The term of the Shengo would be 5 years. The National Shengo was by name the supreme organ of the state. It was responsible to establish the subordinate organ of the state and elect the president and other state leading officials. However, in practice, actual power of the Shengo was artificial or superficial. The military regime, which claimed to be socialist, centralized all political powers under the leadership of the party system. In effect, the 1987 constitution apparently attempted to present the military dictatorship as the proper civilian government. So the Council of Ministers was the highest executive and administrative organ of the People Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and was accountable to the Shengo, and between the session of the Shengo, it was accountable to the Council of the State and the President. The judiciary branch consisted of the Supreme Court, Court of Administrative and Autonomous Units, and other courts established by the law. The President, Vice President, Judge of the Supreme Court were nominated by the President and approved by the Shengo for 5 years terms, and other judges were to be elected and recalled by the Shengo and their respective levels. Generally, the constitution of the military regime and the constitution of the imperial regime of Haile Selassie served only to legitimize the political power of the central government. The Ethiopian political system, the two governments seriously lacked the process of constitutionalism. In other words, although they were written constitution, they were invariably failed to ensure the prevalence of rule of law and constitutionalism. The 1991 Transitional Charter the ethnic-based liberation movement came together immediately at conference and drafted and approved an interim constitution, or otherwise also known as the Transitional Charter. The charter is a very brief document with only 20 articles. The aspirations stipulated in its preamble includes guarantee freedom, equal rights, and self-determination of all people, ensuring peace and stability by bringing an end to all hostilities, redressing regional prejudice, and safeguarding rights of citizens through democratically elected and accountable government, and rebuilding the countries and restructuring the state. Interestingly, the Charter, in spite of its briefness, put a high premium on human rights. This is manifested in its direct reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its Article 1, which states that based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, individual human rights are respected fully and without any limitation whatsoever. In accordance with the aspiration of the Charter, Article 2 gives recognition to the right of nation, nationality, and people to self-determination, thereby guaranteeing their right to preserve their identity, culture, history, and language, and self-administration with fair and proper representation at the center, and independence when above-mentioned rights are denied. abridged or abrogated. Thus, the Charter, in contrast to Ethiopian legal and political tradition, gave an explicit recognition to the right of nation, nationality, and people, and also recognized the right to secession. This strong assertion of the right of nation, nationality, and people demonstrates the commitment of the new regime towards group rights and decentralization, even though that was not what's on the ground. So the process of decentralization initiated by the Charter was further elaborated by regional and self-government establishment proclamation number 7, 1992. Accordingly, 14 national or regional self-government whose border were determined based on settlement structure of nation, nationality, and people were established. Hence, during this period, one can say that some degree of federalism has been introduced, even though federalism has to wait until 1995 to appear in the Ethiopian constitutional public speaking. In general, the transitional charter was a breakthrough in many ways. For example, as we have seen, it established a devolved administrative unit on the basis of ethnic and linguistic criteria. On the basis of the charter, 14 regional governments were created, and Addis Ababa and Redwa were given autonomy on the basis of political and population considerations. And each regional government shall have executive, legislative, and judicial power in respect to all matters with their geographic territory, and except such matters as defense, foreign affairs, citizenship, and the declaration of state of emergency, national economic policy, and so forth. In any case, decentralization was one breakthrough and the basis of political program of the transitional government of Ethiopia. Secondly, the charter granted self-determination act succession to all nations and nationalities and people of Ethiopia. Article 2 states that each nation, nationality, and people have the right to preserve its identity and have respected, promote its culture and history, and also recognized with the right to administer its own defined territory and effectively participate in central government on the basis of freedom, fair, and proper representation. Thirdly, the Charter allowed the creation of several centers of power and authority, and the different associations, especially the political parties, has flourished following the promulgation of the Charter. Thus, political pluralism is another departure of the Charter from the Ethiopian constitutional tradition. When we come to the 1995 Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution, uh, it is different from that of the imperial and the Derg constitution. It made an important departure in the history of the constitutional development in the country in terms of its basic content and organization of the government. The constitution strongly affirms and expresses that nation, nationality, and the people of Ethiopia are the source of sovereignty. So it explicitly states the right and duty of the federal government and as well as the prerogative of the regional states. It also states that the political power shall be held through free, fair, and periodic election. So it entitles the Ethiopian citizens to exercise their human, democratic, political, and social, economic right and freedom. So it defines the right of nation, nationality, and the people of Ethiopia to exercise their self-determination, including the right to secession. Article 39, beside the Constitution, recognizes and affirms fundamental human rights and freedom in conformity with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments. The Constitution established a federal state structure with 9 member states or regions that exercise legislative, executive, and judicial power in their own jurisdiction. It also established a parliamentary system with 3 branches of the government: legislative, executive, and the judicial power performing different functions. It's a bicameral parliament, House of People represented in the House of Federation. The parliament had the power of the legislation on matters related to the federal government, and the constitution provided the House of Federation with the power to interpret the constitution. This makes the Ethiopian constitution unique in that the power to interpret the law of the constitution is given to the government body other than the judicial branch. The Council of Constitutional Inquiry is given the power to investigate constitutional disputes, assisting the House of Federation. An executive organ led by the Prime Minister, whose office is accountable for the House of People Representatives, is set up. The executive branch includes the President, the Prime Minister, the Council of State, the Council of Ministers. The President is elected by the both legislative members for 6-year term, and the leader of the largest party in the lower chamber becomes the Prime Minister, who submits cabinet minister for the chamber's approval, and all ministers serve for the duration of the legislative session. The executive power is in the hands of the Prime Minister, who is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Force. Similarly, an independent judiciary with the Supreme Federal Judicial Authority vested in the Federal Supreme Court is established. Likewise, state have the State's Council with the legislative power, state administrations, highest organ of the state executive, and the judicial power vested in the court. And the judicial branch is composed of federal and state court, and the Federal Supreme Court is the highest court and exercises jurisdiction over all federal matters. The President and the Vice President of the Federal Supreme Court are recommended by the Prime Minister and approved by the lower chamber of the legislative. Now let's look into the stage in the ratification of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution. The first stage is the drafting stage, which is drafting stage with the first stage of the formulation of the 1995 Federal Constitution. A special body known as the Constituent Assembly carried out the drafting task. Experts with a good deal of experience from other countries were invited to such seminars and workshops that have helped immensely in sharing experience. The second stage is the discussion and development stage. This stage involved extensive public discussion on the draft of the Constitution. This can be termed as popular discussion and ratification of the Constitution. This extensive discussion on the drafting gave citizens of Ethiopia the opportunity to know the tentative provision that would be part of the final Constitution, amend or to improve the provision before they enforce it into action, participating in the formulation of their own Constitution. The third and final stage is the ratification stage. It's also known as adoption or endorsement stage. Constitutional Assembly, a special body, constituted body of elected representatives of the nationality people of Ethiopia, accomplished the historical task of ratifying or endorsing the draft of the Constitution. In the Constitutional Assembly, about 538 elected citizens participated, and the Constitutional Assembly thoroughly and conspicuously discussed on drafting of the Constitution for 3 weeks. Each provisions or article draft was passed by the vote. Finally, the signature of the Constitutional Assembly endorsed on the 8th of December 1994 and came into force on the 31st day of August 1995. Now let's look into the objective of the 1995 Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution. The preamble, which is an introduction to the main body of the Constitution, determines the objective and principle which the nation, nationality, and the people of Ethiopia share in common, building a political community based on the popular will or argument that the destiny of nation, nationality, and people of Ethiopia. Second, to have the rule of law at the foundation of the political community built based on the popular will. Third, ensuring lasting peace, democracy, and development that would characterize building a prosperous country. Fourth, maintaining and consolidating the effectiveness and successful unity based on diversity through guaranteeing and securing the right of nation, nationality, and people of Ethiopia to self-determination, including after secession. What are the fundamental principles of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution? First, sovereignty of the people. It indicates that the power is vested in the hands of the people, as stated in Article 8. All sovereign power reside in the nation, nationality, and people of Ethiopia. Hence, citizens are legally recognized as they are the ultimate source of political power. Supremacy of the Constitution. According to Article 9 of the Constitution is supreme law of the land. Any law that contradicts with the Constitution has no legal effect. Third, separation of state and religion, or secularism. In the long history of Ethiopia, state and religion were inseparable entities. However, today, according to Article 11 of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution, state and religion are separate, and there is no state religion, and a religion cannot interfere in the affair of the state. Fourth, respect for human rights and democratic rights. Human and democratic rights in the current Ethiopian have the legal protection and stated in Article from 40 to 44 of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopian Constitution. Accountability and transparency of the government. This principle is given recognition in Article 12, Article 1, of the Constitution, it denotes that the government should be responsible for its function. The conduct of the government affairs shall be transparent, and any public officials or an elected representative is held accountable for any failure in his or her duty. Furthermore, the following can be considered as a salient feature of the Constitution, like the recognition of the diversity, the introduction of federal political system, the provision of basic rights and freedom, unity on the basis of equality, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, and and so on. So, all in all, the Ethiopian constitutional order, as expressed mainly in its principle and partly in the preamble and the aspiration provision of the policy objective, is one in which the popular sovereignty, constitutionalism, human rights, secularism, transparency, and accountability of the government becomes visible.